Now, you know, we're talking about Matthew 5:7, blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Now, one of the things that we recognize is the Beatitudes. One, and by the way, this is one of those things that it's easy to overlook or to just kind of gloss over. This is a sermon being taught by Jesus. I mean, how cool is that? Where we actually have a sermon by Jesus being laid out for us, and it is the heart of this sermon is how he lived and how he thought and his emotions and how he wants his people to mimic or mirror those same things, to follow his example. I read, Calvin and I have talked about this 100 times. We read old sermons from pastors and evangelists of decades and generations past. We love them. And I get it takes me places when I go back and I read sermons of some of the men of God of yesteryear. And all of a sudden I recognize if I apply that same principle to what we're doing here, we're talking about a sermon by Jesus. How cool is that? I mean, and as we go through this, recognize he is the master teacher, the master preacher, and he builds. He starts out, you know, we're talking about the Beatitudes, of course, but he talks about being poor in spirit. That is a heartbeat. We're talking about humility. We're talking about me understanding my place before God. And so we, said you cannot move forward in spiritual health if you're not humble. If your view of yourself is inaccurate, if you're arrogant or you're condescending or proud. And so then he begins building. He goes, okay, now we're talking about mourning, because if we understand who we are, one of the effects of understanding who I am before God is I'm going to recognize my humanity. I'm going to recognize that I have warts. I'm going to recognize my weaknesses. But what does the Bible teach us about weaknesses? It says, in my weakness, I'm strong. Why? Because I'm humble and I recognize that I'm not doing it in my strength. Right. Julie mentioned that this morning. I do it in my strength. What, it's exhausting.
That was that Martha Mary thing.
The Martha Mary thing.
I played the wrong role.
Trust me. Yes, I'm humble. Yes. So as we go through this, I want you to recognize that every aspect of this sermon builds on the last one. You can't skip around. This is not where you can just kind of skip around and pick one that you're comfortable with. This is one where we started at the beginning, and Kevin is very faithfully putting these together on YouTube, because if you've missed them, or if this is something that you need to go back and watch this, because I think there are layers of truth in here. And then we get down to verse 7. It says, blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Oh man. It's ironic, because as I started thinking about mercy, praying about mercy, I began to recognize that I think one of the truths here is, one, we've talked a lot about how forgiveness is how you and I can be most like Jesus. We can be most different from the rest of humanity, because forgiveness does not come natural to humans. Forgiveness flows from the heart of God. It is demonstrated by God. It was Jesus' life by definition. So if I want to be like Jesus, then I must be aware of this and allow God's love to flow through me, and you can really see it in forgiveness. Here's another one, mercy. Because mercy is, if you ever watch kids on a playground, you begin to recognize that mercy is not something that comes naturally to kids, This is, it's just, it needs to be taught by example. So the first thing, I spent all week thinking about this, because, so how can I teach by my example how to have mercy? How to have mercy. And I believe the heart of mercy is compassion. And so I'm going to read you a verse. I don't think I have it on my PowerPoint. I had it on my other PowerPoint, but I had to change them for technical difficulties this morning. I blame Kevin. See, if you grab a pen and just make a note of Matthew 14:14. This is one of these verses I think that are layered in practical application, being lived out by Jesus. I love it when I can watch Jesus and see exactly the steps that I need to go to become more like him. Matthew 14:14 is one of these little overlooked verses that I think has layers of this in it. It says, and when Jesus went out, and you should recognize that this is step number one. If you want to have compassion, if you want to have mercy, the first thing you have to do is go. Because if you study the ministry and life of Jesus, one of the things he did was he got out of his comfort zone and intentionally put himself in the presence of people that needed him. They needed salvation. They needed forgiveness. They needed all of the healing. They needed all the things that Jesus had, and they needed to get close to him. But one of the things that Jesus recognized were people were not going to come to him. He needed to go to them. All right? They started coming to him when he got popular, when he started doing, the great miracles and all these things. And people are flocking because they want to see. I want to see, Who doesn't want to see somebody raised from the dead? It's exciting. The people started coming to see the miracles. But the truth is, when Jesus was ministering to change hearts and change lives, he went to them. He made himself available. So that Matthew 14:14, when Jesus went out, when I teach this, I use the word go. All right, he went out, he made himself accessible, and then what? He saw. That's point number 2. He went, and then he saw. And when he saw, what did he do? He saw a need. How easy it is for us to surround ourselves with Christians. Surround ourselves with people that we are, not just Christians, surround ourselves with people that believe like I believe. Yeah, how easy is it to surround myself with people of like faith, and I find a comfort in there. I find a comfort zone in there. There's very few challenges in there, and it's easy to, your faith isn't growing in that moment because you are not going out and putting yourself in the presence of people that need to find Jesus Christ. And that is what Jesus is demonstrating in Matthew 14:14. It says, he went, he saw, and was moved with compassion. You notice the progression? He wasn't moved with compassion until he went. He wasn't moved with compassion until he saw their needs. He saw their needs and was moved. I experienced this, frankly, in funerals. I experienced this when I'm visiting people in the hospital. I'm experiencing this, as a pastor, I experienced this. And by the way, I think there's layers of truth in here. I'm getting lost in my sermon. One of the truths in there is it's possible to go and not see. It is possible to be around people and be so, for lack of a better term, self-focused on what I'm experiencing. I'm trying to remember, my wife talked me into going somewhere years ago. I can't remember where we went. I do remember where we went. We went to Orlando. My wife had a tax conference. She's an enrolled agent for the IRS, something she doesn't advertise. And I don't blame her, I would be ashamed of that too. But she had to fly to Orlando for, they do annual upgrades on all the new tax laws and all the new foolishness they're doing. And so she had to go to this to stay enrolled. So we flew to Orlando, and while she was sitting in a room full of CPAs, which is very exciting, I was at Disney World, riding rides and, enjoying myself. You get the big turkey leg things, and yeah, I was suffering. And one of the things I remember was, frankly, I was burned out. Michelle thought it was good for me to go and just get away from work, I remember sitting on a plane, and when you get on an airplane, don't you hate it when you're in the middle seat? You got people on both sides of you. And if you're a big guy that's less, I was 135 pounds more then, so they were no happier about this than I was. Because I was taking up their little armrest thingies. And I remember sitting on the plane thinking, please don't anybody talk to me. Just let me sit here and be quiet. And one of them, a lady on my left, was trying to visit and chat. And frankly, I was chatted out. I was tired. What is my point? I was going. I was in the presence of people that had some needs on some level, and I had turned it off. Because all the way there, I was just quiet. Michelle, you know how they do airlines. She was somewhere else on the plane. I was back in steerage in the back. And you know what I remember about that flight? They ran out of sandwiches by the time they got to me. I was so grumpy when we landed. Anyways, confession is good. But Yeah. Now see, this happened, what, 14 years ago, and now I'm all grumpy again. It's possible to go, it's possible to see needs, but remove your heart from the environment. It's possible to go to see the need, and rather than showing mercy, because the very definition of mercy is, yeah, you have a heart of compassion, but the word mercy is actually more of a verb where you are acting on that compassion. You are seeing a need and you're moving with it. What do you need to do? What need is there that needs to be met? I had a very favorite college professor, and he taught a class called Christian Manhood, which fascinating class. I'm so glad I took it. But one of the things I remember every class, he started every class by saying that he said, my definition of a Christian man is one who sees a need and takes care of it without being told. He sees a need. That is almost the very definition of mercy. Mercy is where you see a need, your heart is moved with compassion, and you meet the need in the abilities that God has given you to meet it. And you know, and I'm not, this is one of those certain mercy. This is one of these things where I read a study this week, and I should have jotted down the exact numbers, and I didn't. I read a study this week where they did a nationwide poll. It was done not done by a Christian group, but it was a nationwide poll on what Christians think the characteristics of Christians should be. They said, when they asked thousands of Christians just on a poll, they said, so what do you think are the characteristics or attributes of a Christian? And so they're like, they're saying, well, we're loving and we're forgiving and they went through this list of things, basically the Beatitudes. So then they went to exactly that same number of people that are not Christians. They don't even pretend to be Christian. And they went to them and they asked thousands of them, so tell us, what do you see as the characteristics of Christians? And it was kind of embarrassing. Because they're like, number one, on every list, every poll that they did, was they were judgmental and critical.
Yep.
Judgmental and critical. We had a couple that used to come to church here. And they came to me and they said, can we go to your church? And I said, well, I don't know, do you tithe? And they didn't think that was as funny as I did. But I thought I was really hilarious. And so they said, come to find out, they went to 2 churches in Colville, and they were living together, they weren't married, and there were children involved, and it was just, frankly, it was a mess. And the churches that they were attending were not welcoming to them because they didn't. So they came here. And I told him, I says, I swear we will protect you and love you. I told him, when you walk in the door, sit down and experience Jesus, experience his love, and we're going to show you what that looks like. And they came here for a long time. In fact, until they moved, they were here. This was their spot. And I did their wedding in the park. We did a kind of an informal thing, just kind of a hot dogs kind of reception. And the thing that I remember most is they were drawn to believers that showed them love.
That's right.
I've got to tell you, these people were not perfect. They had issues, they had problems. They needed somewhere to go where they could be around Christians and grow in faith to where they could grow closer to God and understand what it meant to be spiritually healthy. And that's what Garden Valley offered them. They offered them a safe haven to come in, sit down, and experience the love of God. And I can honestly say there was zero judgmental, zero. I'm going to tell you another funny story. I think it's funny. If I offend you, I offend you. We had a gal that retired from the Coast Guard. She retired from the Coast Guard, came to church here a lot of years ago. This is probably 15 years ago. So anyways, she sat right over here, about where Janet is, and she'd sit there, and she wanted so bad to be a Christian. She was drawn to this, and she came every Sunday. She was there, and she cared so much, but she was a little rough around the edges. And when it came time for prayer, she almost always had prayer requests. She had family and people she worked with, she wanted us to pray for, and she dropped the F-bomb every Sunday during prayer time. Every Sunday. And I'm proud, I'm honored to say, not once did anybody blink. Not once did anybody look at her. Not once was there a shred of anybody being judgmental, because that's where she was in her spiritual journey. And she needed to be surrounded by people that loved her, surrounded by people that would allow her room to make mistakes, allow her room to grow, and that is mercy. Mercy, sometimes just loving them, just giving them room to grow. And I think that is like college level Christianity. College level mercy. Where it's easy to be merciful for people that you approve of. People that, and by the way, Jesus talked about this. It's easy to be merciful to people that you approve of. But it's a lot harder when they ruffle your feathers. It's a lot harder to show mercy. So you say, well, what does that look like? There was this guy, you may have heard him, named Jesus. And he loved people that hated him. He loved the people that were going to kill him. He loved the people, and he showed them mercy. Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. A level of mercy, that is a standard that I am being held to, that Jesus holds me to. When we look at Matthew chapter 5, the thing that I want you to remember, that I think this is incredibly important if you're reading this and trying to interpret it accurately, is Jesus is surrounded by a religion, Judaism, that was very external and very proud and very critical and very judgmental, all these things. And the inside of the cup was corrupt and the outside of the cup looked very pretty. And so when Jesus is going through here, he's dealing with matters of the heart. You cannot show mercy if your heart is not in lockstep with the Spirit of God.
Sorry. When
I show people mercy, it is not something that I do because I want to do it. And hopefully the longer you walk with God, the more natural this will become. But you know how it is when you change habits or you create new habits? You have to be aware. It's trying to think of an illustration. You remember when you learned to drive a car? 10 and 2, which is a brake, which is a gas. And when you learn to drive, you think about every step. And everything requires thought. And you go to turn and you're watching. Everything you do. Now, 90% of the time when I drive from Caldwell to Kettle, I have no memory of driving from Caldwell to Kettle. Somehow my little pickup is like a mule. It just knows where it's supposed to go and how to get there, and it takes me home. And but remember, when you're first learning to drive, everything is effort. Everything is, you got to think about it, and there's like no muscle memory. And showing mercy, I believe, is that same way. Because we start in the morning by walking with God before we ever have human contact. Right. We are beginning our walk with God, and we're beginning to draw close to Him because we want His Spirit to flow through me and to control me. And so then if I start out there, then what? As I begin to go through my day, I am intentionally aware of God's Spirit and how He impacts my life. Oh man, I think that's incredibly important when we start talking about the Beatitudes, because it is the Spirit of God flowing through me, not me doing some incredible thing for somebody that needs a hand. No. I like to think that when God leads somebody, by the way, I consider this a divine encounter, a divine appointment. God leads somebody into my life that needs a hand. They need a hug. They need a word of encouragement. I think 90% of the time, God leads people into my life, and my showing of mercy is to listen. Active listening. I listen to them. I find that as I actively listen to people, they will eventually show me their heart. And as I intentionally, actively listen to people, I can assess, the Spirit of God will show me what their spiritual need is, what it is they're battling, what it is that needs to be addressed. And they kind of reveal their heart, their motives, their desires, what they're dealing with, their hurt, their pain. And then God will lead me into this divine appointment on how best to address. This is showing mercy. This is showing mercy. Not showing mercy is when I look at them and I decide in my heart that they need to do some religious thing that I think is very important, and for me to push them into a religious act that their heart is not ready to go there yet. When I begin to push people into religious actions, attitudes, behaviors that their heart is not there, I'm actually encouraging them to be a hypocrite. I'm actually encouraging them to move ahead of God. That's what He's doing in their hearts and in their lives. What I want to do, here's the way I envision this. If I walk behind people, I tend to push them. I push them into the direction I want them to go. I think, okay, this is how it worked in my life, so that must work in everybody's life. This is what we do in our church, so it must be effective. And so if I get behind them and I push, well, that's not mercy. If I get out in front of them and I lead them, and they have to struggle to keep up with me, and all of a sudden I recognize I've been a believer since I was 6 years old. I have read my Bible since I was 6 years old. I've sat through tens of thousands of sermons, and I am not in the same place spiritually that they are. God led them into my life. What does He want me to do? He wants me to walk beside them. He wants me to walk beside them, and as there's an opening for me to minister to them, then I need, with love and grace and gentleness and kindness, to gently plant seeds of the Word of God in their heart. And sometimes when I'm walking beside them, especially if we're dealing with grief, it's a hug. When my father-in-law was getting ready to pass, I was at home, and Al's getting ready to leave the world. And he's laying there, and my sister-in-law called me. And Chris calls me, and she says, Shane, Dad's getting ready to die, and that's kind of your thing. You need to be here. That's kind of my thing. Can you imagine a higher owner?
No, cannot.
They're hurting bad. They are grasping, in some sense, without hope. There's a sense of the unknown, and God put my name on their heart. They're saying, that's your thing. You need to be here. Why? Not to hear a sermon, not to get great words of wisdom by Pastor Shane. I need to walk in there and be calm and loving, give them hugs, and I need to tell them, Al and I, we talked about this. My dad and Al talked about this, and assure them of hope. Assure them of the promises of God. Gently walk beside them in their grief. That's called mercy. People having needs hurts. Grace and mercy, we find them operating in tandem often. But I think grace, by the way, I struggled trying to wrap my head around the difference between grace and mercy, because I have some very simple, shallow explanations for both. Usually when I say, grace is God giving you what you don't deserve, mercy is God not giving you what you do deserve. But I think it goes much deeper. I think grace, when we study the heart of God and we talk about grace, all of a sudden I think we're moving into an area to where God is addressing my sinfulness. And I am standing open and naked before Him without excuse. And in my humanity and in my weakness and my frailty, I am totally honest and transparent before God. And God looks at me and chooses to love me. I think it's grace, and God gives me His. I think grace has a flavor of God looking at my sin and saying, I love you, I forgive you. I bestow my goodness, my righteousness on your account. Where I think mercy is a matter of the heart. I think when God looks at me and He's dealing with mercy, He's looking at, there's a level of sinfulness, and He says, I've forgiven you, so I'm not gonna. You ever have somebody, you ever watch kids and they're wrestling and one of them finally yells, mercy, I've had enough, let me go. Yeah, mercy, where you are not getting what you do deserve, But I think a lot of times we deal with mercy, it's more of an emotion. A lot of times there's regrets, and a lot of times there's guilt, and a lot of times there's pain and there's suffering. So when I'm dealing with mercy, a lot of times I'm dealing with matters of the heart. And they need to experience the great physician. They need to have the healing of God in their lives to experience his mercy. The problem is if I am judgmental and critical when I approach this, if they have done something that I find morally reprehensible, or if they have done something that offends me on some level, or they totally disagree with me on any level, and if I go into this situation rather than just having the love of God move me, the mercy of God flowing through me, what I will do is actually set up an obstacle that prevents them from drawing closer to God. And that is one of my greatest fears. One of my great fears is I'm going to say something or do something or have an attitude where people begin to look at me and not look at God. When I'm demonstrating mercy, I don't want them to see me. I want them to see God. I want his attributes to flow me through such an extent that when they look, they don't see me. They actually see God flowing through me. That's what you and I are called to do as believers.
Yeah.
That is the standard that Jesus set.
That's the Holy Spirit of God.
Pardon me?
That's the Holy Spirit of God.
That is that is perfect.
So, when
that
your
is the
heart's
Spirit
right,
of God.
when your heart's right, you can open your mouth
Yeah.
and godly stuff comes out.
The secret, I think the secret to everything he just said is just start first thing in the morning. When I go to get up, when I'm laying in bed, I like to, as I'm starting to get up, which the older I get, the longer it takes me to get up. And as I'm starting to get up, and by the time I got time to say a whole prayer before I make it out of bed, and it's like, God, you're going to do some amazing things in this community today. All I'm asking is that you plug me in somewhere. Allow me to be a part of whatever it is you're doing. That takes all my stuff off the table. And all that does is open up my heart, where I'm just like, God, you're going to do some cool stuff. Just let me be on your team. I want you to plug me in wherever you have prepared me to serve. And Father, just let me be faithful. That's it. Just allow me to be faithful. And in case you didn't notice, I never touched our handout today. And since I don't like to admit defeat or failure, this is called homework. Yeah. You're going to go home and, on the very bottom, by the way, you taught me this. On one of my handouts, I put the term digging deeper. So now every time I type up a handout, I'm looking for that digging deeper. What pushes you deeper? Very bottom on the back. Mercy. I figured it's about 28 times it's used in the New Testament. It's the feeling of one who is moved. We see a need and we're moved. Moved with compassion by the sight of another's suffering. More, the mercy forces us to respond. It's more than just seeing. It's more than just feeling. It is a response. I gave you two thoughts. Mercy is compassion in action. And mercy is action that helps the helpless. And that is our calling as believers. Yeah.